exclusive interaction that we're bringing up on the show. In fact, Apple now finds itself at the intersection of geopolitics and growth ambitions. And even as it looks to expand its presence in India with new stores, the company is navigating tariff pressures from Washington. We speak to author of Apple in China and tech journalist Patrick Mcgee on trade tensions and how Apple is looking at navigating through these challenges, Trump's U.S. manufacturing push, and Apple's big bet on India. Thank you very much, Patrick, for joining us here on ET Now. I appreciate you taking the time out and speaking to us here on the show. Now, we're speaking even as Apple is looking at opening stores in 2 more geographies in India, in Bengaluru and Pune. How does Apple view the Indian consumer market overall? Is it a near-term growth engine for the company, or is it a longer strategic bet?
Well, let's see. I have some internal documents that call India, quote, a vast pool to be exploited, which is an interesting turn of phrase. Back in 2018, 2019, I believe only 1% of the Indian market was iPhone. Within a few years, they were able to ratchet that up to 5%. And I think the big hope, and this is what people within Apple have told me, is that I can become the next China, which would be about 20% of the market. So that would mean that they could quadruple market share in India, which I think is a more than feasible outcome, considering India's GDP, I think, continues to grow around 7% a year. It's probably the largest growing middle class in the world, and it's the most populous country on the planet. So that seems more than attainable, and that would mean, real remarkable growth for Apple, which is a company that has basically penetrated, the smartphone world. I mean, basically invented it, but it's hard to grow much more in, let's say, America. And they're probably going to see falling revenues in China. So India really is the big driver on the world map.
Right, Patrick. Now, let's also talk about Donald Trump's threat to Tim Cook to not manufacture in India, in fact, move it away to the United States. Now, given that Trump is looking at making in the United States that manufacturing push that Donald Trump is giving wants for Apple to happen, especially as far as the U.S. market is concerned, will that have an impact on how supply chains move, particularly Apple supply chains?
So they sound like they're the same thing, that both countries want to see iPhone production. In fact, they're very dissimilar in ways that are beneficial to India, because I don't really think there's any cannibalization, if you will. So the things that are not really moving to the US, but that are already there and expanding are some of the higher value added, like the Corning glass that was, frankly invented, Gorilla Glass for the iPhone back in 2007. And they've just sort of pledged to do more out of Kentucky. That wasn't something that was really going to move to India in the first place. And I think down the line, we're talking about semiconductors out of TSMC, and now the semiconductor packaging, which is a rather complex process that happens after the chips have been fabricated. That too is going to happen in America. What we're talking about moving for India is for starters, the final assembly. And then you would sort of work backward from there. So you already have Tata in Hosur building the chassis for the phone. And then you would just continue to go back out and back out. But I don't think you were ever going to have the entire depth and breadth of the supply chain, in particular, some of the most high value added things like the glass, like the display. Frankly, even for the Chinese made phones, a lot of the most high value added stuff comes from either Taiwan or Korea, and in some cases, Japan. So if India is to replicate China, I mean, that is a difficult feat on its own, let alone getting the most high value added components out of Korea or Japan. So everything that's going on in the US, I honestly don't think it's really in combat, if you will, with all that's going to take place in India. It's a very lucrative device, and there are 230 million of them a year. There's a lot of growth to go around.
Right, Patrick. Now, let's also talk about trade tensions, because we have to understand how will trade tensions between U.S. and China unfold for Apple's China business. There may be a 90-day pause that U.S. has given to China, but broader tensions about manufacturing, they still persist. How will they pan out for Apple?
Yeah, so don't get me wrong. The trade tensions themselves are a massive deal. I just don't think the investments in America were actually all that newsworthy. They were more of a rope and pony show for Donald Trump. I don't think there was actually all that much substance to them. So insofar as India needs to take over a lot of what's going on in China, That is so difficult for Apple because Apple has to portray the move to India not as a retreat from China, but as an expansion to India. But it's happening at a time when iPhone volumes aren't in a particularly expansionist phase. And so they're in this tricky position where what they're having to do is move some certain operations to India while pledging to Beijing that more of the supply chain that will remain in China will be more Chinese. That is to say, less Taiwanese, less American, less Korean. And so Apple has this really tight balancing act where if they don't move quickly to India, they will continue to be stuck in China. But if they run to India, then they will risk backlash from Beijing. I frankly don't know how they pull that off. And it's the stakes are very, very high.
Right, Patrick, just a final couple of questions before we let you go. Now, how do you see Apple's strategy evolving over the next 2-3 years amidst these policy disruptions majorly happening in the United States?
Because you need probably in India thousands of Chinese trained engineers who know how to build the production lines, work the machinery, and do so many different things from plastic injection molding to metal stamping to dozens of other tasks that have really only been done in China at the quality that Apple desires and in fact demands over the last 20, 25 years. But Beijing's making that sort of move difficult. And I don't know how Apple sort of, negotiates for that to be different. I think New Delhi would have to negotiate for that.
Right, just one final question before we wrap up this discussion, Patrick. Now, Trump announced Apple that it made an investment to invest another $100 billion in U.S. manufacturing. So, Patrick, are you suggesting that Apple won't succumb to pressure by Trump? Because, they announced some investment a couple of months back, and this is an additional investment that's coming in from Apple into the United States.
Well, it depends what you mean by work. I've talked to a whole number of Apple operators and people from manufacturing design who have universally no idea how Apple gets to $100 billion in the US over the next 4 years. The company really is not transparent, and anyone doing the back of the envelope math essentially has to put their arms up and say, we have no idea how this gets to $100 billion. But that's not to say that it didn't work. It worked splendidly well. Tim Cook entered the Oval Office with a literal gold bar and some glass made by Corning, presented it to Donald Trump, and seems to have the president off his back. Now, maybe that lasts for a few weeks. Maybe it lasts for the rest of the term of the president, but it worked, right? I mean, that's sort of what Donald Trump demands, that sort of show of fealty. And so that's what he's been able to pull off. I don't know how long that lasts, but in a sense, it looks like they've checked the box for U.S. diplomacy. It's pretty opaque how they're doing in China, but China doesn't want them to leave. So the big open question is how are they doing in India, and what can India offer for Apple to move sizable operations there without Apple sort of risking backlash, both from Beijing and from hundreds of millions of consumers in China, where they have a $70 billion business.
Right, Patrick. So you suggest that Apple has checked the box on U.S. diplomacy, but whether that leads to more pressure being put on by Donald Trump on Apple, that remains to be seen. Meanwhile, you say that Apple will remain consistent with its India investments. Thank you very much on that note for taking the time out and speaking to us here.